And now I've got the pleasure of introducing Deborah. I've been following Deborah's work for a long time, and so I'm really excited to have her here this evening with us. Deborah Jiang-Stein is a product of foster care and adoption, and an award-winning writer, public speaker, collaborator, and author of the short story collection Lucky Tomorrow and her memoir called Prison Baby. She also has several other works on her website, which I'll be putting the link in the chat so you can take a look. Deborah is the founder of the unPrison project, which I think she'll probably be talking about a little bit tonight. And that helps to work with people in prison to mentor them and build life skills and talk about the future. So I will be putting a few links in the chat. And with that, I will turn it over to Deborah.
Thank you, Betsy and team for inviting me to be part of your group. So, and I'm glad that this is informal. I was saying that earlier because I'm not an academic person. That's not the kind of presentation I do. In fact, I think of it more as a dialogue, which we'll end up doing. I always welcome questions. That introduction kind of gave some of my journey. A product of foster care says something right then. And I'm going to talk some about that, but then also how I got to where I am now. And as I was thinking about today, I realized that how I've told my story has changed over the years. My early story was a secret from me and a lot of people because I did come through foster care briefly and ended up in adoption. In a permanent family, in a strong permanent family, and I about 12, 10, 11, 12, learned that I had been born in prison. And that's a long story. And I wrote about that, how I learned that in several other places. But what the thing that got me into a spin was that I learned that fact and nobody had talked to me about it. I knew I'd been adopted. I later learned that I'd come through foster care. And, my kind of elevator speech about that is that it spun me into a dive. And by the time I was, I don't know, 13, I was using street drugs and drinking shortly after. And by the time I was 18, I was an IV drug user and addicted to multiple things. So none of that is because of where I started out, and none of that is because of anybody other than that's the path I took. But as I started to tell my story, I was reluctant. I I I didn't just jump from what I told you to being in recovery for over 20 years and some other things, but I ended up knowing that I would probably die, and I moved from the West Coast to the Midwest and started a journey of healing and visiting my story, which I didn't know much of. And I was an early writer with some art agencies, and I was doing writing workshops in prisons. And a warden said we would invite you to speak to the whole, we'd fill the gym with chairs if you would tell your story. And I said, I don't really know my story. I just know facts. And they knew because think how many times you need to put your birthplace on a form, anything. And so I don't think about that all the time because that's all I know. But of course, when I was signing up and getting access to prisons, there it was. So I turned that offer down. I went on doing writing workshops in schools and prisons, freelancing, and another warden in another state asked me to speak to the general population. And again, I said no. I didn't know my story. I didn't know what to say. I just thought I have the facts of my story. I just hadn't really put anything together other than I hadn't died. I was on my way to being healthy. And I knew that I was a writer and doing creative work, but I didn't know enough of my story. So that happened in maybe 4 or 5 different prisons. And I recognized that I was saying no because I was afraid, and not of anyone in prison and not because of anybody, but not knowing my story and afraid of my story. So I started to accept offers, and it wasn't, and I was also looking at articles and writing a book because I knew parts of the story were things that I wanted to be public about, but none of it did I want to be public about with my birth in prison. And so the first time I ever said what I'm telling you was inside a prison. I accepted an invitation, to speak in a prison. There were 200 women there, and I have no idea what I said other than what I'm telling you. That what I learned when I was young, I went into a spin. It had nothing to do with my family or my background, and that I needed some way out. And for me, writing and art was a way out. So the response I got was, it shocked me. Women started crying. And I left there and I've been surrounded by mentors, which is, I always say this is one reason I'm here: support, community sports, family, and mentors. And one of my mentors said, "Did you ever think that they were weeping because they felt hope?" And I hadn't thought that, because my question to her was, I made people cry. They're sad. I left everyone in a lot of pain, and it was just the opposite. But it took me a while to learn that. I then went into another prison, told what I knew of my story, talked about my journey, said I'm on a path of healing, just like I hope you are. And the same thing happened. And eventually I understood that truth, that there was hope and triumph rather than grief and only sadness. And we're a culture of either or. And what I recognized is it's really and. There was sadness because I was showing up as a product of many of the women. About 80% have had children, and many, many, many have lost custody, like my birth mother did. I was allowed to stay a year with my birth mother in prison. She had a 10-year sentence for drug-related crimes. I try not to talk a lot about her story because she's not here with us, but she is in spirit, and I feel like I'm telling our story, but mostly mine, and hoping that it can help people and there's a message in what we're talking about. And so I kept doing that work, and I learned more and more about my story, and I went back to the prison where I was born in West Virginia, and I petitioned the Federal Bureau of Prisons eventually to give me all of my birth mother's documents, because what I wanted were my birth documents, because I still knew very little. So that's how I learned that I ended up in foster care. That's how I learned that I'd spent a year with her in her, whatever it was, a 4 by 6 cell. And the first time I started saying that, well, like I said just a minute ago, I only spoke those details inside prison. And the first time I said that at a conference I was keynoting in, I could hear people gasp. And this is where I realized that how I tell my story and who I tell it to makes a difference. So I originally would tell my story that I came from, and this relates to that either or and. I had been reading and been told that I'd had a fractured beginning, that I'd come from a traumatic childhood and an early start that was not corrupt, but ruptured my mental well-being. And that can all be true, but what I only learned like about 5 years ago was to really speak my truth. And the story is that I was born into a place of love. People don't associate that with prison, but even when I wrote my memoir 10 years ago, I was telling it as only a story of a fractured beginning. And it can be both things. I was born into a place of love. It's what I think of as my first home. And in some ways, I mean, there were what, 200 or 300 women there, and my birth mother. I know that prisons aren't safe. I know that they're not ideal at all. And sometimes I think they don't need to exist in certain situations. But for me, it was a place of love and safety. And prisons aren't safe. So the first time I started saying that in public, I realized that I have to really attach that to saying, this is my experience and this is my story. Because I'm not saying that prisons are safe. I'm not saying they're cozy, loving places. But for me, that was my experience. And that's brand new in telling my story that way. So I'm going to jump back to when I started speaking. And then I realized I wanted to do more than just tell my story, and I was hoping also it would give the women and men that I meet, because I work with men as well and youth, that they would feel worthy enough to also tell their own stories in ways that they felt safe. And I don't know if that's happened, but that's my really some of my mission. And from that early speaking, I then started building life skills seminars. I'd bring in, because I'm an artist, I would bring in theater people, other poets. I brought in two opera singers, and which was a remarkable experience. And I don't even know how to describe that. And when I did that, some of the women said, "Well, do men ever sing opera?" And I thought, that's the difference between the have and have nots world that we have created, because mostly it was men. And so I really like to kind of open up the world that is so closed behind bars, and not only just with me, but bringing in, we get donations from, I say we, and I'll tell you about the nonprofit, but donations from publishers, children's books and adult books, brand new books. And some of my mission is to advocate for literacy. I have found that, and there's research on it, but the average reading level is about fourth grade, fourth or fifth grade, which is pretty astonishing in this country. And so I have made an effort to donate books into visiting rooms, also create some reading programs, and a sort of a small program about how do you read to kids, because not every, if you haven't been read to as a kid, then you don't know how to read to someone. And just like literacy is learned, so is illiteracy. If a child has never seen an adult read or has never seen a book in the house, why would that be of any interest? And I think that literacy is just really opens the door. I mean, I was thinking, so if someone can't, when I first started this work, if someone can't read or write, how, when they get out, how can they fill out a housing application? How can they fill out an employment application? So it's some basic things that most people take for granted that they can read. We then had a partnership with an eyeglass company, and they donated 50,000 reading glasses, because I realized that we can donate books, but if they're sitting there, even if they can read and can't see the page, so that we actually got rid of those. It took about 5 years, but we distributed those around the country. And that's a lot. I thought that is a lot of pair of eyes that are seeing 50,000. And I don't often hear feedback, so I don't know the outcome of that. We have some, it's not that I was looking for that, but thank you letters. So that's the kind of thing that I do through my nonprofit called the unPrison Project. And most people think by unprison, what I'm meaning is out from the bars, and there is that, but I'm thinking more the opening up of our human selves to be able to read, to be able to find safety, to grow the way I was given. And it's one of those it's one of those either or and things. I'm asked if I would have really wanted to stay with my birth mother for the rest of my life. Well, the child in me would say, of course, who wouldn't? But if I hadn't been taken out of that prison and had the journey that I was given, there's no way I'd be doing the work I'm doing. I had an opportunity to go to college, which took me forever. I'm one of those people that took like 8 years to get a degree, but I was determined to do it. And so that's how I really became super committed to what education can do, because I was given those. And like I said a little bit earlier, I was following the track of my birth mother. I really, when I was a kid, really thought that was my destiny, that's where I should end up because she did, those are my people, that's my way, is what I thought. And again, we're just a culture that there are more than two truths. Two things can be true. And I really feel that that's how I'm growing, even still, to telling my story, that there are several ways to use our voice and to have our truths. So the story of my memoir, which I'm sitting here, and I know something will go out, but I wrote it as a novel because I was only talking about my truth inside prison, but in public I was not. And I wrote it about, you know how there were made up memoirs a while ago. Well, I was the opposite. I had a true story that I was assigning to characters, and I had an agent at the time, and she pitched it, and publishers loved it. But they said, we know, she says in her bio that this is her true story. We want a memoir. And I walked away from that. I wasn't ready to be public with it. And I had a couple offers like that, and it wasn't even about money. I just said I'm not ready to be public about my story. And I eventually did. And the only reason I did is I was in a conference, and it was a conference of professionals, social service professionals. And someone said to me, well, your story really is about secrecy. And what I recognize is that everyone has a secret, everyone has something they're ashamed of. And in the Q&A after, someone came up, a guy came up and said, I haven't told my wife I've been divorced twice. Then a woman came up, pulled me aside and said, I haven't told my children I have cancer. And the more I was public about my story, the more I heard other people's secrets. And it's not that I'm asking for that. I think because I'm vulnerable, they felt saying that. And that's when I thought, my story in a book actually is like other people's story. It's just the facts are different. People were telling me their secrets, were showing me what they were ashamed of. And none of them had to do with prison, but I realized I'm not really telling a prison story. It is a story about coming out of secrecy, and then what do we do with that? And I've had several conversations recently. I did not set out to write my story, and I didn't set out to be a speaker or even do what we're doing tonight. I used to do product development for Scholastic and Weekly Reader, and I made toys, learning games. And I've always been creative, and I love that. I had a small creative team, and every once in a while I'd get a call from a prison, which is what I was telling you about, to do a writing, earlier, to do a writing workshop. And I would begrudgingly go. And then I'd get another call. This was just the writing workshops. And then it led into the wardens asking me, which I referenced earlier. So it's not like I landed in my purpose. I really, whether it was divine intervention or I believe it's definitely what I'm meant to be doing. Some of my friends say, well, you were lucky you were born with a job. In a way, I was. I was just given this story. It became my job, but it was pretty unintentional. And I was thinking, these days, if you talk to me tomorrow, if I talk tomorrow, I'd have a completely different thing to say. But similar, I was in a donut store the other day, and there was a raspberry bacon donut. And I thought, who would have thought 5 or 10 years ago that there'd be that combination of things? And to me, that kind of represents that we aren't just one thing. We aren't what people think we are. People hear my story, and I didn't like the title of my book, the memoir Prison Baby, because I had spent my whole life getting rid of labels, and here was a label. And it's actually a marketing decision because one of the editors said, well, it'll show up on a phone really well, and that's how people look. And then she said, and it'll give you something to talk about, which is true because it's not how I think of myself, but it serves the purpose of what it is. But it speaks to what people think my story is. I was somewhere and someone said, oh, I know you're that prison baby. And I said, no, I'm a mother. I'm an entrepreneur, I'm a speaker, I'm a writer, because that label is gets stuck. But I realize I can't control what people think. And I learned that with my new book, a collection of short stories. Also, now that I've spoken some of my story, people who read the collection of stories is titled Lucky Tomorrow. You'll see, readers will see that my story is in there. Thank you, Betsy. But I had no idea. The first review said something about it's an interesting book. They said it's a great, some of the stories are about mental health. And I had no idea I was writing about mental health. I was writing about characters and they were in their lives, and there is a mother who has had to relinquish the rights to her child. So it's the reversal of my story. But I realized we can't control what the public thinks. So a couple reviewers started writing about mental health, and that's thinking that that was what I set out to do. And I don't have a problem with that. It's just not what my plan was. So sort of like my story or everybody's story, we have no idea what people will make out of who we are. And it's become my job just to stand in what I believe. And, like I said earlier, that changed. I used to really talk about having a fractured beginning, and I don't feel that right now. I know the facts. I know it's unique. It was disruptive, but what's highlighted for me, because I've had so much positive out of it, is that really the core of it all was love. There's a reason that I was allowed to stay, even that the warden allowed me to stay for a year, but also they didn't know what to do. There are, I think, 7 nurseries that are been functioning for a while in women's prisons around the country, and I visited most of them. And it's controversial. So the shortest one I think is 18 months, where the infant can stay, and the longest one is 3 years in another state. And to me, the best alternative is not to sentence women when they're pregnant. Definitely not shackle them, because what is a woman going to do when she's giving birth? Run? So, which is crazy to even think that there is still shackling in some states. I believe 13 states have banned that, but it still exists. And I've always been an advocate for community centers where if a woman is pregnant, she can be sentenced, quote unquote, to housing in the community, be monitored if that's necessary, and have a as normal as possible beginning for the child and the mother, because in a way we're sentenced as the offspring of incarcerated mothers. We get that sentence at birth. So I don't say that I was sentenced, but I had an inmate number. I was called baby girl doe in the file because I found that. And so that, I mean, that happens out of a system that is not seeing people as individuals and worthy women. So I how are we doing on time? I do have more stories to tell, but and I also want to leave plenty of time for questions.
You're good. I have a few questions. There's none in chat yet. So if people have questions, go ahead and put them in, but continue on. You're doing great.
Okay. So I want to say that in conferences, those have been the biggest learning for me, because I'm here as a speaker. My first speaking was not knowing what I would talk about. I literally had to ask the planners and then ask wardens if they were bringing in. And it was a lot of time and a lot of back and forth, because I said, I know facts, but what is it that you are trying to have me do for people I'm speaking with? And I could never put those things together, because I had been so secretive on my own about my story that I really hadn't known that there was value in talking about my journey and talking about the deep early pain I had and not knowing who my people were and where I came from. I did do a search at one point. I'm reunited with my birth family. My birth mother had died, and that works for some people and it doesn't work for other people. I feel like all of our stories are so unique that just the way when I'm asked about, do I think all babies should be with their mothers in prison when they're born? And I don't really have an opinion about that. If the sentence is short, I say, why not? But what if, like my mother's, birth mother's, it's 10 years? Then what's the answer to that? And I don't have an answer. Maybe there is a, I've been invited into prisons in Africa, and I'm trying to think whether it's Ghana or I think or Kenya, because both those prison chaplaincy groups have invited me in. And I haven't done it because of their funding. But what I learned is in some places there, when a woman goes to prison, they bring in the kids. So they might build a middle school for, small, I mean, not like the kind of schools we're talking about here, so that the 10, 11, 12-year-olds can have an education and live with their families. And that's a fascinating, I don't know enough about that to give any kind of expert information, but when I heard a version of that story, I thought that's brilliant, really. Because being with someone, whoever, whether it's a father or a primary caregiver who is family, at a cellular level, I think that is the strongest way to go. I believe that I'm who I am because of staying with my birth mother and having that time together. It was a fascinating experience to meet my birth family because for the first hours, they all just stared at me and they said, "You talk like your birth mother, you move your head like her, your hands are like her." And so for me, and for anyone who's had unification like that, it's a striking experience. I don't know that I had holes in my heart, but I had a big gap and it just suddenly just slammed shut because I was hearing people talk about my people. And I felt like I fit in some way. And that's a really common universal theme is to belong. And that was for me the one of the biggest issues that I just really didn't know where did I fit in foster families or in prison, my adoptive family, and there was nothing wrong with them. I should say that both of my parents are educators, college teachers, and so that's one of the reasons that education for me was pushed, and one of the reasons I'm a believer that I know it changes lives because it changed my life. And maybe I'll field a question and then some more will come up for me if that works at your end.
Thanks. Yeah.
Get a drink of
So
water.
yeah, go ahead. I'm gonna put the link for, oops, if I can do this correctly, did it come through? For the program recordings in the chat, so everybody has that. And I realized that Deborah was probably on the picture when I was showing, this is Deborah's book, Lucky Tomorrow, that she referenced. Um, I have a couple of just logistical questions. One is when you mentioned that you had a reunion, was that before or after you started speaking
Uh,
about your
oh,
experience?
that's a great question. I still, and you may be familiar with this, timelines are get wonky for me. And I think
Mhm.
because we've had ruptured timelines, I've never thought about that. I mean, I just now I'm thinking that it was before and then after, so I flew back to Seattle where I grew up, and that's where my birth family was, north of Seattle. And one of my relatives, after I started speaking, said, "But why do you speak in prisons?" And for me, I felt so tied to my birth mother. To me, I have this elevated concept like she's the queen. And we lived in a palace together. And I don't mean that in a disrespectful way. I know it was a prison, but I have nothing bad about that experience. And yet, for her family, they saw this young woman who'd been in and out of prisons her whole life since the time she was a teen and had, I'm guessing, a lot of trauma, which is common with women in prison, especially for anything drug related. And so I met my birth family before I started speaking. And now that you've asked me that question, I'm wondering if putting that piece together maybe kind of he had to do with me healing into going out in the world with that. Although they weren't secretive about it. Everyone knew about me but my birth brother.
Mhm.
When you're adopted, as you know you have people out there. But if you think you're an only child, you just think you're an only child, and all of a sudden he has a sister. So it's been very sweet. I just came out of nowhere. Everyone knew about me though.
Yeah, great. The other question I have, I wanted to go back. You mentioned that more recently you've come to see that prison was a safe place for you and a place of love, and really reframing that fractured past and the story that you've been told. And so I don't know if you can talk more about that. The process of that's a big transformation to have that big of a shift in how you see it and feel it.
It's huge, isn't it? It's
Yeah.
new for me because I haven't even been able to write about it. I can actually tell the story. I was talking to someone who had done somatic counseling, and she didn't know my story. And usually when I meet anyone new, I mean, it's a conversation stopper. If I ever, whenever I say that I was born in a prison. So it's not even at parties when some people do like party games and let's all say where we were born and the first letter. And I dread it, not because I have to say it, but everything stops and it all becomes about me. And mostly I tend to be more introverted. So I was talking to this woman who didn't know anything about my story, and she said, maybe you just want to sit and think about what you're going to tell me. Because I think she knew I was in my head. How do I start this story of who I am? And my whole body started beaming, and I'd never felt anything like that. My body, my face, I remember just grinning at her. And what came out was, I'm a product of so much love. It's unbelievable. Something like that. And then in that conversation, she said, so really, it's about love in unexpected places. And I learned then, and going forward after that, that I've been telling the story the way Child Protection Services had been telling my story, the way foster care had been telling my story, social services, the courts, lawyers, maybe my adoptive family. I don't know that part, but all other people were telling my story about this ruptured, fractured beginning. And it is that. So, and traumatic. But that's not the first thing I say anymore. So it's new to me. I'm new in having it come out that way. Like it is a huge reframing, isn't it? And it can sound kind of wonky to some people, but I knew as soon as I said it, I knew that was my truth.
I can imagine how differently you feel, um, just having that awareness.
I hadn't realized that I had felt that my whole life. I always felt that. I felt it as a kid. I didn't know how to speak it because I didn't know much. And I felt it later when I was angry and lashing out. I felt it. I mean, I felt it all along, but I didn't even know words for it because what came in front of it was anger and frustration and pain. But behind, once that removed a little bit, the real story was in there. And then I was afraid to tell people because they'd say, well, prison is not a safe place. That's not cozy. There's no love there. And all that might be true. My experience is that I had a loving experience. I was with a loving mother. I was safe. I'm guessing it was so unique that the staff and the warden, I actually went back. I forgot they brought down the original warden who was there. She was a farmer in the hills in West Virginia. She had retired. And so she said she didn't remember this, but whether she did or not, but she confirmed because she said something about you've done something with your story. by coming back here, and I thought that's true. I was curious, as I was so curious, as most adult adoptees are, and there's so much secrecy. I still don't know half of it, if you can believe it. I have 900 pages of court records, and I can't even read them all. But what I was interested was my part in there, so I could actually see my baby pictures are in the Bureau of Prisons documents. I'd never seen any baby pictures of me. Isn't that crazy?
Wow.
So all
Yeah.
these pieces started putting me together that this was, I mean, it's sweet. Yes, they're prison, photoshops, but they're still me. They're still my
Yeah.
baby.
Were there other babies, or what do you know what came to be that you were there
Yes.
for a year?
There was, when I went for my first visit, the current warden went to the library and brought down from the archives they call it the inmate newsletter. And so I had the records of how the authorities wrote about my birth, but in this newsletter, they were writing about how my mother had me and how I was laughing and that everyone could hear laughter all the time. That little by little showed me that, of course, she would be happy. Who wouldn't be? She had a baby with her. And I can't imagine the pain that she had when I was removed. My uncle told me that they just snatched me in the middle of the night out of her bed.
Mm.
I can't imagine it to be so helpless. So it took me a while to see her perspective because for the longest time it was just from the daughter's perspective. So
So
there,
some,
I'm sorry,
go
that
ahead.
that one question. There was what I remember is there was a boy called Jimmy. So that someone did, but they were removed. The baby was removed. And I
So
just,
some they knew that her sentence was longer than you would be allowed to be there with her.
yeah, or that also, well, she fought it. Now there are laws that if a parent doesn't have there's a word for it, but can't properly take care of it. There's a legal word for it over X amount of months, then the courts will relinquish. They against that parents will relinquish the rights. So she wouldn't sign anything. They kept trying to get her signed. And then the documents I would read, she'd say, I'm going to sign because I don't want her to have a life like me. And then the next week she'd go, I want to keep her. No one should deserves to take her. So, and that's no place to be forced into a decision. So I can see why she'd wavered like that. And eventually, against her will, I was removed. And then
Mhm.
they had to wait. So this is in the hills in West Virginia. They had to wait for a federal marshal to deliver someone, a woman who was being sentenced because she was from Seattle. It became a financial thing. West Virginia Child Protection Services did not want to pay for my care. And I was about to be placed in West Virginia, I learned, and from these documents, but then they decided it shouldn't be their cost. It should be the cost of the King County in Washington, where she was sentenced from, but how would I get there? So they kept waiting for a marshal to come fly someone down and then fly me back. So some of
Mhm.
it is just very systemic about, the financial structure and then
Mhm.
fighting it.
Mhm. Um, you had mentioned to me in a conversation earlier that uh, as your speaking has evolved and you found your voice and been active on this, that learning how to deal with the media was um, a process. So, and that you actually had some training in that. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yes, I forget about that moment, but People magazine at one point in an interview said, "What's the worst crime your mother did?" And I was stunned when she asked that question, partly because I was there talking about my prison work at the time. Maybe I'd around the country been with 20 or 30,000 women and men talking about life skills and the other things I mentioned. And here's a journalist wanting something sensational. And I don't remember how I handled it, but what I knew was I needed to learn how to have interviews. And because it was also new for me, it's not like any of it came naturally. And there's an organization called Women's Media Center in New York, and I was granted with a few other nonprofit leaders a weekend to be trained in media. And when I was in the middle of that weekend, what I learned is that it's what politicians go through. So if and when I'm asked a question like, what's the worst crime that your mother did? My response is now the worst crime is that we lock up women who are pregnant when they should be in community housing. And journalists, they'll go, but they'll say, but what I asked was your birth mother. What were her crimes? And I'll say, prisons feed the foster care industry. We need not to send people who are addicts to prison. We need rehab and recovery. So I need to know when I'm with a question like that, what's the message I want? Because I knew I didn't want to be Jerry Springer story. I knew that was some of the hesitation for me. I didn't want my story sensationalized.
So you touched on this, and that was actually one of my questions too, of, the um, foster care to prison pipeline and then the prison to foster care pipeline. It really becomes an intergenerational cycle in some families or for some people. So you must have seen some of that in your
I've
work.
seen
Can you talk about that?
I have informally taken one of my board members works in data. Now she's in Kansas City, but she said even a hand raise is like a survey because if I'm in an audience of 200 in a gym, I had a feeling when I'm talking about foster care and adoption. So I've done a hand raise of how many are touched by foster care and adoption. More than half, whether it's their children or their own, which says something about the trauma of adoption and foster care and how that's handled. And I've also, because I'm not trained in any kind of counseling or anything, I've had, although sometimes when I speak, a prison will get volunteer counselors to come in after me because I am so open and vulnerable. It opens up a lot. And I've been in prisons a number of times, and someone will say, tomorrow foster care is taking my child away from my grandmother's house, just weeping. And so I'm sometimes in the middle of a story that's happening like mine. And always hope that a prison has someone who can then be with people after women or men after I speak. I include men because they're parents too. I mean, impacted differently, but family rupture is happens for both men and women.
Thanks. So on your website, I noticed that you have done a little bit of work with Gloria Steinem. So I don't know if you want to talk about that.
A great
Show
story.
some
Yeah.
pictures. Yeah.
I I had at one point early in my speaking, there were something like 31 prisons around the country that had invited me to speak. Jails, state prisons, federal prisons. And I just, I'll get an email still from a warden or a staff person that says, our women need you or our men need you. So out of the blue, I thought, well, how will I fund that? And we get small grants, but how will I fund something in a bigger initiative? And I thought, well, who cares about women? And again, sort of like divine intervention, I thought of Gloria Steinem. And so I look on the internet, I get some kind of office email, and I'm like, Dear Gloria, you don't know me, but I'm doing this prison work. And, it was a very short thing. I'm an author, but my book wasn't out. I got an email back in like 3 days from her that said, and what I wrote her was that I'd been invited to a lot of prisons, and would she be the speaker at some kind of fundraiser or gala, which I had no idea what that even was. She said yes. I know this is at the end of a summer. We were planning something, myself and a small team of volunteers for April. She said yes, and here's my assistant, one of my assistants, and she'll work with you on the calendar. So we flew her in. I got a car to pick her up at the airport. We then went to speak together in a women's prison. Some of the women who were born in the 60s stood up and saluted her. I got
Mm.
goosebumps when that happened. And the younger women had been encouraged to read about her. So they knew all the history. And for the ones that didn't know, I said, well, you're the reason you're called Ms. instead of Miss or Missy or something. And but this, so she spoke with me. And then another year she went into a men's prison with me. And it's a remarkable experience. She was 81 at the time, and now she's at 82, three, in her early 80s, and now she's 91. So she spoke. We raised a substantial amount of money, and I sat with her like you and I are sitting, but only together in person, and had a Q&A with her. And she later told me they were some of the best questions she had. I mean, all of that was brand new for me. I'd never done anything like that. I was starstruck as anyone else was about her. And to be sitting in a car with her, and I brought her snacks because I thought she'd be hungry after flying. And it was in the whole prison, it was remarkable because the staff was excited, the warden, and I've kept the relationship with her. I don't do anything with her. I've done a couple things with her. She helped raise money in another way. In the very first election of this current president, there was a makeup company called Lipstick Lobby, and they decided they wanted to raise funds for liberal organizations. So they created lipsticks for the ACLU and for Planned Parenthood. That was two efforts. And then they contacted Gloria and said, we'd like to make like some kind of lipstick to help fund more liberal causes. I'm trying not to be political at all here. And she said, I had already met her. She said, I'll do it for you if the proceeds can go to the unPrison Project. So the photos you see on the website are from the photo shoot for Lipstick Lobby. She doesn't wear lipstick, and so it was called In the Clear, and I think she made that up, which is a wonderful play on words, and it's a lip gloss. And I don't think it's out there anymore. It was really a short-term effort, but it was an amazing experience. So I've had those two things with her.
That's a great story. And obviously, you impacted her deeply that your organization was the first one that came to mind when she had an opportunity to designate funding.
Well, I was
Um,
right that she had not worked when asked myself who would work, who's the voice of women. She had not worked with women in prison, or had
yeah,
maybe she had an opportunity long early in her long ago. But it's just, I can't believe that I just like got on the internet and emailed her, and then I hear from her, and there we
yeah,
were.
pays to have guts like that, right? To just
It was crazy.
never know, try something and sometimes it
Exactly.
works.
Well,
So,
it's better to, all she could say was no or not write back.
yeah. I'm going to put some links in the chat of some supports that are available through Adoption Network. And I've been doing all the talking. So does anybody in the audience have a question that you want to make sure we get to? We've got a few more minutes. I don't know if somebody's furiously typing, but do you want to talk a little bit about your book, Lucky Tomorrow? I know you touched on it a little bit,
Yeah, I'm
but
happy. I'm extra excited about it. I realize it's not that I'm more excited about my memoir, but I felt more cautious about the memoir coming out. And as I mentioned before, I just love to write, and I've always loved making stuff up and writing fiction, but was tired of my own story. So I thought of the reversal. And that's how I came up with this character who is a mother who has lost access and custody of her infant, born in an institution. And she is in and out of prisons and mental health institutions. She's a flower cart vendor. I love flowers. So there's a lot of me in it. It takes place in Seattle, the Midwest, also Tokyo, where I lived for a while. And well, the irony of flowers is that it's on the cover is that I'm also allergic to flowers. So I'm getting allergy shots for that. But I love that the cover is and flowers represents something so beautiful and innocent, and yet her life is not innocent. but it's beautiful to her. It would again be fractured and troubled for some people, but she's just going on in life, living her life, selling flowers. So that's the main character. The stories are loosely linked. She shows up in and out. That there's then the voice of the adult daughter, which was somewhat easier to write because that would have been me, but in the story, but it's fiction. And it's
Someone did post in the chat that, and I think she came in right after I had posted the links to your organization. She's asking um, a little bit more about your unPrison organization.
Is that the question?
Yeah, so I posted the links again, but if you want to talk a
Oh,
little
I
bit about
see.
it.
Right. Well, it's like I said, it started out with speaking, but now mostly it's partnerships and creating programming and writing. I'm writing a curriculum on mindfulness, all the things that have helped me feel more grounded and grow, and so life skills, mindfulness, something about breathing and meditation. I don't do all of that, any of that formally, but I know I've done it to be more solid in my life. And I thought, well, if it helps me, it could help someone else. And I'm trying to write those things in a way that will be accessible for people in prison. So what I'd like to do, this is where we'll probably need funding, is to print booklets so I can hand them out and not just, I'll deliver something and then hand it out and have it be a real accessible activities to do so that even if there's a lockdown, they can be doing those kind of things in cells on their own and not have to count on staff.
Really important work. Thank you.
Thank you.
I am posting a link for a quick survey. If people who are here this evening want to let us know your thoughts, this is an opportunity to let us know what you think about tonight's program and then also any ideas you've got for the future. So that's the link I just posted. Yeah, you're getting praise for your work with Gloria Steinem and
Well, thank
the
you.
story that you
I,
told in the chat.
I won't. So I'm also happy to have my email go out to people who are here tonight. I use
I
a
did
different.
post that. Yeah, when I posted the link to
Oh,
your
okay.
website and to the unPrison project, I also
Okay.
posted the email
Okay.
address,
There's a
the
general one
office.
of office at unprison.org,
Yeah.
which people can send anything, and I'm sure to see it.
Okay. Good. Um, So I do want to announce our Monday evenings that we have coming up, just so that people know. At the link that I put where you can see what the recordings are, you can also see what's coming up. In 2 weeks, we have The Long Shadow of Adoption, How to Find Light in the Dark Places with Eileen Drennan. And then the week after that, we've got Buried Truth, a poignant story of a man's search for his father, exposing powerful forces bent on hiding the truth. That's what Jim Graham talking about his new book that just came out. And then the week after that, on November 10th, we've got Healing Yoga for Grief and Loss with Kim Dykes. So you can take a look at those. I think I'll go ahead and wrap things up. I don't think there's any other questions in the chat. So thank you so much, Deborah. This was so informative and insightful. And I could just feel how much you have transformed over the years. So, starting, it sounds like, with your reunion and then, getting into speaking, even though it wasn't necessarily your idea in the beginning.
Right.
Thank you for stepping up, and your story has obviously been powerful for a lot of different people. So we enjoy hearing about it.
Thank you.
Um, so thank you also to everybody who joined us this evening. We are a nonprofit organization, Adoption Network Cleveland. You can see us at adoptionnetwork.org. We support families and adoptees impacted by adoption, kinship, and foster care with support, education, and advocacy. We're a membership organization, so you can check that out on our website as well. So thanks for joining us this evening.